Okay, thank you everyone for coming to this lecture. Got another one in the series of Ecologies of Communities. Thank you to Reba for sponsoring. Jubilee.
Thanks, Ben. So today we're very lucky to have Gwen Stacey from Centre of Alternative Technologies, which is an educational charity that is trailblazing in research and discussion for positive solutions for environmental change. And Gwen will be talking about the approach that CAT have to architectural education and how that then relates to the current environmental movement, and also our theme of ecology of communities and the Welsh context that they operate in as well. So yeah, thank you. I'll pass over to Gwen now.
Great, thanks Jubilee for that. Summed it up pretty well. Can you just disable or enable host sharing so I can share my screen?
Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. Great, hopefully you can see that. Yeah, I'll take.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much for the invite to talk today. So I'm going to talk to you about two things really, or the talk's going to be split into two parts. So first of all, I'm going to talk about CAT and also where I fit into CAT and a bit about me. And we can't really talk about CAT without talking about CAT's kind of history in the environmental movement. So I'm not an expert on that, but I can take you through some of the kind of key points. And we'll also talk you through some of the key buildings that we have on site at CAT that are kind of, I suppose, quite interesting in the development of environmental design. And then, as Jubilee said, I'm also going to talk about our graduate school. So we run a series of master's courses at CAT, and we also have a part 2 in architecture course. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what we do on that. And then the second part, given the theme Ecology of Community, I'm going to set out just kind of some thinking and I suppose based around discussions that we have at CAT. And it might come across a little bit manifesto-ish, a little bit demandy perhaps, but I've just tried to throw in a whole load of references and links to some interesting things that you might choose to kind of go on and have a look at of what springs to my mind when I think Ecology of Community. So well done on a kind of great title actually, and something to think around. I've quite enjoyed putting that together. So I'll try and spend about 25 minutes on each part, and then we'll come back together for questions at the end. But please do feel free to put questions in the chat or just to unmute if you don't understand something that I'm saying, or if I'm speaking too fast or whatever it is, then just shout. So first I'll start with myself. I'm an architect. I did what I call a UE CAT sandwich. So I did my part 1 at the University of West of England in Bristol. I did my part 2 at CAT in the previous incarnation of the course we now run. And then finally went back to UE for my part 3. So a UE sandwich. And in that, I had a multidisciplinary training. So both studied architecture and engineering, building services engineering specifically. And then at CAT, it obviously has a sustainability focus. So that led me down a specific path. And I have also done a broad range of practice, working for engineering consultancy, Bureau Happold, doing not very exciting or beautiful graphics, but useful ones nonetheless for the Natural History Museum, that example there. Worked at obviously much scale, domestic projects, both in practice. So these top 2 images were when I was working for Rural Office for Architecture, And then the bottom pictures are kind of just some of the educational things that I've done, and also self-employed practice work. But my current role is as a senior lecturer in sustainable architecture at CAT. And I balance that with a number of other things as well. And I suppose something that interests me is the way that we identify ourselves, and the way that I spend about 90%, 80% of my time teaching and working in architectural practice and in architectural teaching. And then the other kind of 10% of my time I spend doing other things that really interest me. But it's actually what those other things are perhaps what identify me, or what shapes my identity, and what also then makes the architectural explorations more interesting, because you're exploring those peripheries. So I am the chair of a committee that manages 24 listed buildings on this island, Bardsey Island. Only this morning I got this picture through WhatsApp to say we lost all 3 blades of our wind turbine last night. So that was a couple of hours of my morning trying to work out how we get new turbine blades over to them. I'm also a sailor. I'm training to be in the Coast Guard. So I have quite a strong link to kind of anything to do with the maritime environment. I also do some of my own community practice work. I really enjoy making and construction, building my own structures, buildings, boats as well. So that's probably a bit too much of an introduction, but I suppose it's quite interesting for yourselves as to how you choose to identify yourselves, and also how exploring those other things is really important to maintain in parallel to your interest in architecture. So yeah, I suppose I think of myself as a bit of a grazer of knowledge, and this quote, try to learn something about everything about something. So we try to learn everything about architecture, although that's a lifelong exploration, but learning something about everything. We are generalists in our roles, so trying to learn as much as you can about everything and have that feed into what you're doing in architecture is really important. And I suppose it's those exploring of the edges and the peripheries that leads me to working at CAT and teaching on the architecture course there, and having a kind of specialism in sustainability as well. So I'm now going to kind of move on and talk more in detail about CAT. So this is, was that someone just joining? Okay, great. So yeah, this is the CAT site before it was kind of established back in the early 70s, when it was a slate quarry waste heap, essentially. But to kind of understand the context of CAT and where it was founded, so it was founded in the early 70s, and there was a lot of things going on at that time in the 60s and 70s around environmental thinking. So things like the Whole Earth Catalogue came out in 1968. In the early 60s, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is a pretty seminal book that kind of writes about how pesticides can affect watercourses and affect biodiversity. There's also the anti-nuclear movement, and Greenpeace were forming in the early 70s. Now, all of this is of interest because it's where CAT came from, but it's ultimately not when environmentalism was invented, and environmentalism goes back much further into indigenous people trying to protect their lands. So we always have to remember that that it's not just this westernized view of we've been doing this since the 60s, 70s. People have been trying to protect their environments for much, much longer than that. But in 1973, there was an oil crisis, which was one of the main reasons why CAT formed. So this worry that we were going to run out of oil, and we needed to look for alternatives to that. So in 1973, a group of people that were termed the crazy idealists arrived at CAT in an abandoned slate quarry near a small town called Machynlleth, a bit of a name to get your mouth around. And they did so with about a £20,000 donation to set up the site. And they wanted to explore ideas of alternative fuels, alternative ways of living, and it did expand into kind of alternative ways of living very quickly, as a response to those things that were happening globally. So there was quite a large group of people that came to site, and this is, what they found: a series of falling down, crumbling buildings, and a site that was what we might today use the term rewilding itself, reforesting itself, from being a slate heap. And this is not, dissimilar to quite a few places up in the Welsh kind of valleys and mountainous regions, from mid to North Wales. So CAT established itself and got to work, and there was a group of people that just started putting their heads together and thinking about things that they could do. So by 1974, they'd installed their first hydro turbine. They'd also managed to get Prince Philip to come and visit. So they were obviously making interesting progress, interesting enough for Prince Philip to decide to come along and see what was going on. The first buildings on site were occupied, so up until that point, they were all in these sort of caravans dotted around. And the experimentations kind of developed into a whole range of areas, not just into energy, so also into food, into farming land use, into water systems, waste systems, and then also into construction. So in those early days, they built the first building on site, what's called the tea chest, because it looks a bit like a tea cozy, is I think why it's called that. So there were lots of energy explorations at CAT, and if you visit today, there's still the relics of many of those things at kind of on site. And what's really interesting is pretty much you name it in terms of the technology, it's been tested at CAT, and the ones that succeeded are now pretty much mainstream technologies as well. And CAT's, I suppose, always been at that kind of forefront of exploring these new ideas, testing them, breaking them, seeing what works and what doesn't. And lots of people have associations with the organisation and the site and its history, and have set up businesses and are now also market leaders in the area as well. So there were lots of what you could call brave experiments and lots of useful failures on site. And a long-standing kind of member of CAT, Peter Harper, describes it as failure as the compost of success. So where you get all those failures, they kind of come together and mulch together into what will eventually be success. So on the bottom images here, we've obviously got a very early wind turbine design there. There's a methane biodigester, which we're doing a lot more of now at large agricultural scale. It doesn't really work at a human scale with human waste, just because of the climate and the inputs being just a little bit off. Parabolic solar collectors. So we don't really do that in the UK because we don't have enough sunlight. We've got plenty of daylight for solar panels, but not enough for these kind of parabolic collectors. So there are lots of these experiments. And in the kind of late 70s and also in the early days, CAT was exploring environmental design and what it meant to do environmental design. And it made a lot of mistakes as well. so spray applying foam to caravans, which just made them hideously condensate, and is a pretty grim material as well, to be spraying onto something that you're living very close to. But there were some successes as well. So exploring daylight use, insulating stone buildings. I mean, the amount of insulation there and the way that it's built pretty much exceeds what you might see on a modern day construction site. So they were doing a lot of things right back in the 70s, when these things weren't very commonplace. Also exploring thermal stores as forms of solar design. And all this thinking has kind of been developed over time as well. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the key buildings on site at CAT and talk a bit about them. So first of all, the conservation house at CAT was built in the 1976, architect Peter Bond, and it was sponsored by Waits Construction as a kind of model house. It's beyond Passive House, and that was about 15 years before Passive House even existed. So the wall build-up has 450 mil of insulation, quadruple glazing, heat pump, MVHR. We don't even do quadruple glazing anymore, but heat pumps and MVHR are very much the kind of commonplace these days. And the heat demand was 10 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum. So Passive House minimum is 14 kilowatt hours, so it was below that. But it's pretty ugly, and it also should have faced south, so it completely lacked any solar gain and overheated in the evenings because it was predominantly west facing, even with that limited amount of glazing and the fact that it's in a kind of mountainous area, it's still overheated, so not ideal. So next, kind of into the 80s, I'm obviously only cherry picking some of the buildings on site. In 1987, the Segal house was built on site, and there's been a strong connection with self-build with Walter Segal, and with the kind of architects and thinkers at CAT as well. So for those of you that don't know about the Segal method, it's well worth diving into it and exploring it. But in essence, it's about using standard size sections of timber that you can buy from your local timber merchant. Basic lap jointing of timber so that there's no fine carpentry involved, so that it's basic, anyone can generally do it, following a pattern book. There's no wet finishes, so you use timber boarding and things. And it's ultimately about enabling people to build their own homes, and to do it themselves and to do it cheaply. But this method of construction is also very poor in terms of its airtightness. One of the things we do with our students is do an airtightness test of this building. It gives some very revealing results, and it's quite fun to walk around with the smoke machine, seeing just all the places where it does leak. So there's also lots of thermal bridges, but that's equally because there's almost no insulation in the building at all. Has awful sound insulation. You can hear everything that's going on in the building. And it also wobbles in the breeze, which isn't necessarily a problem, because it's still structurally sound, but it just shows the kind of extremes that Walter Segal went to kind of make an efficient design. So really minimizing the size of timbers down to their ultimate minimum, that they could be. And if you come to site, you can actually stay in this building still. Remarkably, it sleeps about 16 people. But it's actually, I would say, one of the best houses to sleep in. It might be the gentle rocking of it. So some other key buildings. So the actual CAT site is elevated up on the slate heap. And through the 70s and 80s, they really struggled when they opened as a visitor centre to get people up to the main part of the site. It's a pretty large amount of steps, which if you're kind of unfit or anything like that, then it's quite a challenge to get up there. So CAT introduced a water balanced cliff railway. So the way that that works is there's 2 trains and they're connected with a cable that goes over the top and connects to each of them. So when one's at the top, it fills with water and that makes it heavier. That then runs down and the other one has had its water, it gets rid of its water at the bottom and that makes it lighter, so it goes up. So it's water balanced. There's no energy required at all beyond just allowing that water to flow in, and that will take the people up the hill. So at the time when that was built, there was a top and a bottom station built as well by architects Pat Borer and David Lee. Pat and David still teach on the course. Pat's very much involved. David is kind of infrequently involved, and we describe both of them as our visiting professors on the course. It's well worth looking them up and finding out more about them. There's an excellent book about David Lee's work called An Architect of Principle. And during this kind of time in the 90s, there was also an increased awareness of the materials that we use in buildings. So these buildings were built with homegrown oak and also recycled pitch pine so the pitch pine came from old warehouses that were being demolished, and the oak was sized based upon what the sawmill could provide efficiently as a waste product. So Pat went to the sawmill and said, what can you give us that's going to be affordable and that's a reasonable size? And they said about 1.8 meters. So it's all designed around, I think, a 1.8 meter grid, roughly. And then there's other local timber. So you can see the forestry on the other side of the valley. So a lot of that was used in the roof structure. It also had breathable construction. So they were starting to understand that. Cellulose insulation, very common these days. So those were the top and bottom station built in 1990. And then into the northeast, buildings I've picked out here. So the ATTIC, which I think stands for the Autonomous Materials, and importance of considering materials really came through, and thinking about low embodied carbon materials. So ATTIC uses rammed earth for structural members and passive design principles, plenty of daylight. And there's also no cement or PVC in the ATTIC building. And it was also on a very early form of a district heating system. The Strawbale Lecture Theatre obviously does what it says on the tin. It's Strawbale and it's a lecture theatre, and was one of the earliest Strawbale buildings in the UK as well. Obviously, straw's been used in construction in the UK far before this through use in cob, but one of the very early kind of modern Strawbale buildings. And this was a Strawbale infill. So there's 2 types of Strawbale building, load bearing and then infill. So there's a very large number of Strawbale buildings and lots of systems now as well that you can look to employ that technology. But this was one of the earliest out there. And then finally onto the WISE building. So WISE stands for Welsh Institute for Sustainable Education, and it's the home of the graduate school, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this was completed in 2010. There are a fair few hiccups, and we're very honest about those. So there's a rammed earth lecture theatre within this drum. That should be built, and they tried to cut corners and put too much earth in. So essentially the way that you do rammed earth is you put 100 mil of earth in, and then you ram it down to 50 mil. They thought, we'll put 200 mil. When you ram that, it only ran down to about 150 mil, and you don't get the binding that's really key. So when they took the formwork off, it fell down, which was quite a costly mistake for the contractor, because it was quite clear to see that it was their fault. But the rest of the building then is a glulam post and beam frame with a monolithic 500 mil walls made of hempcrete. And also employed mass timber decks, so not using CLT, but using an alternative form of mass timber where you don't have so much glue. Also, it's got all the kind of renewable technologies that you'd expect of the Centre for Alternative Technology. So solar thermal panels, heating the water for all the bedrooms beneath. The largest photovoltaic roof in the country of its time, which also just gives a really lovely kind of dappled covered seating area beneath it as well. And it's a really beautiful building and really well detailed and carefully considered. So I'd encourage you all to, if you're ever in Wales, to come and visit and have a look around. Pat and David are, well, it's their kind of best work, and it's all there on show for you to walk around and see and explore, and also to learn from, because it was pushing boundaries in terms of these materials and these details. And there's a lot that we're still learning from it. So, because I'm not really going to touch on this later, I'm going to kind of finish on this talk around CAT, or I suppose the kind of the end of the discussion about the buildings is in materials. Now, thankfully, low embodied carbon is becoming much more widely accepted and discussed, even in the last couple of years, which is a real relief, because CAT's been pushing the agenda for it for a long time, and people are finally cottoning on. It's yet to be regulated really in the UK, but there's a massive increase in the resources and tools out there. So Hawkins Brown have got Herbert, which is a Revit plugin tool that looks at embodied carbon. Field and Clegg Bradley Studios have got a really good tool that you can get through their website that works with the ICE database. So those are both things worth looking up for your own academic studies. And if this isn't being discussed in your studio, then push the agenda. It's really important that we do. But low embodied carbon isn't always friendly. So we also still need to be careful. So if we're going to use more timber and use more crop products because they're so-called carbon sequestering, now there's a whole debate around that I won't get into, but we still might use pesticides on those crops. We still might use fertilizers that can cause environmental damage. If we're taking our forestry from monocultures, then those monocultures are kind of pretty environmentally damaging. So we've still got to think further than just low carbon, and think about the holistic material impacts of what we study, of what we specify. So we at CAT advocate this kind of 80-20 approach that Peter Harper kind of coined. So you can think of that in terms of pre-industrial times. There were buildings were mainly constructed with low tech, low carbon materials, because that was what was available. Early industrial, there were there was more availability of high performance materials so that we could get more light into our buildings. So that provided, a much needed increase in the standards of our buildings. And then through to today, what we currently do and what's currently mainly done is that we use high performance, high impact materials in 90% of what makes up a building, and we decorate it with 10% of natural materials, the low impact materials. So here's an example from the Wales Millennium Centre in Cardiff, where the architect decided to suspend slate off of a steel structure when slate could be used to build a wall and roof a building, but instead they choose to use it as a finish and then have to build this massive steel structure behind. So it's a really damaging way of building. And what we advocate at CAT is this kind of 80-20 rule, where if we can use and build 80% of our buildings with low carbon materials, or possibly even net negative materials, net negative carbon, then we allow ourselves the 20%. So this might be glass, it might be wiring, just to get us to that modern standard of construction and modern standard of environment that we expect and need. And we like to call them at CAT industrial vitamins. So they're the supplements to the building that is needed to make it low carbon. So what's CAT doing now? CAT's does its own research, and this kind of strand of research has been carried through since the 80s. And our most recent report sets out how we can reach zero carbon in the UK by 2030, and sets out one scenario of how we could do it. Now that's a kind of technical scenario. It obviously relies upon a huge amount of other things as well, of which CAT's also explored. So well worth having a look at those reports. And they touch on a huge range of areas. So land use, diet, transport, construction, obviously, retrofit, all those sorts of things. Then we also have increasingly advocacy and outreach. So we've recently set up a zero carbon hub where we're supporting third sector organisations, local authorities and business to reach their climate ambitions and their kind of carbon ambitions as well. So everywhere that's declared a climate emergency, we're now able to support them through our zero carbon hub. And then we have our education wing. So that's in the visitor centre. We run short courses. There's a range of webinars that you can watch online as well. Those have been increasingly delivered during the pandemic and lockdown. And then also the graduate school. So the graduate school, we've got 9 courses that we run. And all of these are MSCs, apart from the MArch. So these are in a kind of range of different areas. So sustainability and adaptation, green ecology, food, behaviour change, energy. Those are kind of the broad areas of those masters. And then the MArch as well. And so because of the kind of history of architecture at CAT, we also set up the first the professional diploma and now the Masters in Architecture within the graduate school. And I'll talk a bit more about that now. So the MArch at CAT, we run quite differently to any other architecture school in the UK, apart perhaps from the London one, London School of Architecture, I think. Not that we run similarly to that, but that's kind of a different model as well. So we run a 22-month course. We are ARB prescribed. We're not RIBA accredited. And that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter at all, in fact. So just out of interest, to be accredited by the RIBA would cost us around £15,000 a year. So it's just not worth it for us when we have a small group of cohort. We wouldn't see the benefit. We wouldn't see the benefit out of going down that route. That's not to say that we would never, we wouldn't look into it if things changed. We absolutely would. We're also guided by our students. If our students ever kick up enough fuss and say, no, we really want to be RIBA, then we would look at it more. So the way that we teach is in 1 week intensive residential teaching weeks. So we all descend on site at CAT for 1 week a month. And those weeks run from a Sunday evening to a Saturday morning. And we run teaching sessions in their varying formats from 9 in the morning till 8:30 at night. So when we say intensive, they are intensive. But everyone's living there, everyone's eating together. So it's a really kind of communal sharing and learning environment. And we call it a community of learners, with everyone that teaches on the course actively engaging in that community. So during the weeks away from CAT, there's obviously coursework time that students work on, and we provide tutoring during that time as well, which we were doing before the pandemic over Zoom and Skype, and now it's kind of just what everyone's doing as well. And then students also have the opportunity to work part-time 2 to 3 days a week while they're away from site. And I suppose we're called sustainable architecture. We'd rather just be called architecture, because we believe that's what we should be doing. But we do really live and breathe sustainability, and it's in everything we do, and it creates lots of really interesting conversations as well. So as I said, we're a community of learners. We're non-adversarial. So we kind of reject the competitive nature that some schools choose to adopt. We have quite a practical, hands-on focus, and we have a range of modules. You can kind of read that yourselves. We like to work regionally in Wales. We really think it's important to think local, engage with our local communities in, around Wales, but still act globally within that. And if I had to sum it up, I would probably say it's serious fun, which Chris Loyne, who comes and teaches with us every September, he's coined that phrase, or kind of playing in the woods, really. Yeah, so that's a little bit of the about the course. My email's at the end, so feel free if you have any questions kind of after this call talk that you want to ask about that as well. So I'm aware I'm probably running over a little bit, so I'll whiz through the next bit. But first of all, we're going to take a 30-second break. And if you can look outside and look at least 20 meters away, please do so. Or if you haven't got anything, you can't look outside or can't look at anything natural, just enjoy the wren fledglings on the screen for the next 20 seconds. So I'm going to stop my camera and mute for that. Great. I'll carry on. The reason for doing that is that, one, it's really important that we allow time to rest our eyes, and we're trying to do that as much as we can in our teaching, which is really challenging. And also connecting back to our environment is a really huge part of CAT and also our well-being, which I'll kind of go on to. So I'm going to try and whiz through the next bit, just touching on the kind of themes. So talking around ecology of community, and I suppose what that brings to mind. So I'm going to talk around 9 key areas: home, play, practice, collaboration, co-design, co-construction, well-being, technology, and structure. So first of all, home. I think it's really interesting about how we choose to live, and where things might change in that area. And something for you to explore in your own studies, if you're ever doing any housing projects, is what are those structures that we put in place in terms of how we live. So there's an excellent report by Studio Weave called Living Closer that looks at all sorts of different types of the way that we should live together. But this, the ideas around that have existed for thousands of years. And these are the Fijian Tulu, I'm probably pronouncing that awfully, are a great example of a really equal way of communities and people living together. So there's no penthouse at the top. Everyone owns a vertical strip of the building, and then there's common land in between. There's ways of living more flexibly and allowing flexible space that I think we all need to explore. So Half a House by Elemental is a kind of one of the often quoted ones, but there's lots of examples. And this is a really interesting model that's being set up in Bristol at the moment by an organisation called Bright Green Futures, who are sort of developing themselves as a housing developer, but delivering co-housing. So they invest their fees that they get from selling houses into facilitating new communities and providing community space. And that takes away a lot of the kind of the need for co-housing to be set up or by generally people that have a lot of time. So or the availability to do it. So it hopefully breaks down some of the inequality that there is around living more closely together. So next up is play. And I think we all need to embrace play far more and have a discussion about what play is and how important it is for our state of mind, and what we deem to be play. So to some extent, I would describe when I'm kind of in the shed tinkering as play, when I'm out sailing, probably as play as well. So it's not necessarily a passive time in your mind or a time that isn't full of production. So we both need to embrace it for children as well. And there's, I suppose at CAT, we're really interested in pedagogies and way of thinking and child development, but also in adult thinking and adult development. And there's some excellent resources out there. So Nils Norman, who's an art practitioner, has kind of recorded an incredible amount of play spaces around the world. So well worth looking into and thinking on play. And bringing that into practice. So I would say that we need to reject the anesthetic of practice, that thinking that we sit at a screen all day and we bring into architecture only really a visual sense, and that architecture should be an aesthetic kind of journey and discovery. So we should work with materials and work one-to-one in practice. And a lot of that is about rejecting also a kind of a capitalist way of working. So we need to embrace site as well, think regionally. I think this office encampment, how more regionally can you get by setting up an office on a site that you're going to design in so that you really understand the microclimates. Find time, ultimately. Mary Arnold Forster is an inspiration. Kayaking 2 days for a 2-hour site meeting, I think is a brilliant approach to practice. And then also think about how we can practice radically. So this project by Dennis Anderson, Castle Park Village in Kinsale in Ireland, where he was wanting to explore this kind of freehand architecture. So actually developing and designing whilst on site, and almost designing intuitively. You see how that links back to the kind of play as well. So those are the first three. The second three is about collaboration. So I'd encourage you all to learn about consensus decision making and how important that is really in making a better way of working into the future. Even a system of voting on things creates winners and losers, even if you're all kind of generally on the same page. So whereas if you'll commit to always reaching consensus, you have to really listen and understand what people's views are. So we actively teach this and try and engage our students to work in this way at CAT. And there's lots of examples of it working really successfully as well. So lots of cooperatives do it. There's one example there, Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op. If you go on their website, they've got a great graph of how much, how unaffordable student housing is, and how it's all kind of being fueled by student fees, and if students come together, you can actually make it much more affordable. And by trying to move to consensus, we have to acknowledge that there are inequalities and try and break those down as well, and seek alternatives to the traditional kind of hierarchical structures that are everywhere really in society. And of course, linked on to collaboration is co-design. And it's great to see that you've had some previous speakers as well who've probably talked about this and working with communities. But it's really important to acknowledge the type and extent of participation. So if you haven't studied it, Arnstein's ladder of participation is the kind of go-to reference point to start thinking. There's obviously much more out there, but also how this can be criticized, because if you're not, because of structural issues and inequalities, and if there's no trust, then this system completely falls down. But I think architects are placed really interestingly to be the facilitator and be the listener, and practice active listening, which is a challenging skill to master, really, to really listen and understand what people are saying, and not to respond with your own view, to respond with appropriately. And we can also be the curator of imagination as well. So then on to co-construction. So I've touched upon self-build and the Segal method, and the empowerment that can have. And that's a lot of where the kind of practical and hands-on learning comes at CAT, is because we really see the benefit of it. And there's also a really strong intersection with natural buildings inherently, or natural materials. Inherently, those natural materials are really easy to handle, they're really understandable, and they don't require huge amounts of knowledge to put together. So we're able to engage people in co-construction. It can develop people's skills and confidence, but more importantly, it can develop a sense of community and well-being, to the extent that Down to Earth in Swansea has been partnering with universities and health boards, and hospitals and doctors are now prescribing people to go to building sites and work with Down to Earth, because it can help those individuals develop a sense of community, develop their confidence. So there's really interesting research about just that process of putting things together ourselves and having that sense of achievement, and the simple power of that. Really interesting. Finally then, we need our mental and physical well-being, and our health, when we're practicing, when we're working, when we're collaborating and being involved in communities. Thankfully, this is becoming more discussed, but we need to continue to discuss it, and we need to do a hell of a lot more in architectural education and architectural practice. And to do that, we need to kind of look at the pace at which we do things and the routes at which we navigate through these areas. And we have to work to best practices. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from, say, Montessori education in terms of how we teach architecture, whereby you progress to the next step when you're ready to progress to the next step, not when the deadline is there, and when the resubmission deadline is there. And if you don't meet that, then you're not achieving. Is that really the best way that we should progress through education? And also the simple activities of coming together for tea or coming together for food are other ways that we can kind of improve our well-being and think about our well-being. Technology then, So this is technology, I suppose, in the sense of bringing people together, and also then having an awareness of the risks of technology. And I've put this bottom picture in there because it's, I suppose it's quite difficult to capture the risks of digital technologies. Whereas we can look to physical technologies to kind of show us that actually there's some big mistakes to be made, and we just need to be really careful about implementing technology. And there's something hugely powerful about the fundamentals, about the pen and paper, about the whatever that is, glitter in a bowl, and engaging people. And also then looking at the technologies of our past, and reinterpreting them and how we can use them to look to the future as well. Finally, then, I think I've time just about are the structures that govern us. So in architecture, we really need to work much better at this, and it's great to see that there's architectural unions developing. There's architectural action coming through for architectural assistants who have often been kind of undermined in practice. So yeah, we have to question the way we live and work. We have to kind of push and pull it, and I think disassemble and reassemble some of these structures as well. And ACAN is another great organisation. The Architects Declare, Architects Education declares. Here's a kind of lesser known piece of work by Emma Appleton, who sets out 100 ways to make an anti-capitalist and also anti-patriarchy building site. There's quite a good TED talk, although very poor quality, by her online that you can look up. But we need to look at these things as well and be active participants in changing the structures that kind of govern us, instead of just being kind of grumbly old cynics. We've got to engage. So I think all of those things together are, I suppose, informants and elements of how we work together in a community of both architectural practitioners, but also as members of community and society as well. And just as complex as ecology is, I think there's far more that I've probably missed out, and far more relationships to things that make it a really interesting kind of topic area. So diolch am gwrando, thank you very much for listening, and I'll open up to some questions. So maybe I'll stop sharing, hoping that Ben or Jubilee are going to come back.
Hey, sorry, it just froze for a sec there. Thank you so much for that speaking, Gwen. That's really, really nice.
It was so good. Thank
I have
you.
a quick question about, so you spoke about Montessori schools. Is there anything, do you think there's any sort of those philosophies of that teaching method that is adopted within CAT's teaching?
Interesting question. I suppose not enough. Some of our students actively choose not to get marks, and we allow them to do that. Facilitate them in doing that, so that it's just purely about their learning and their feedback, and that's what's driving them. That's, I suppose, one element. The design and build projects is perhaps a bit more project-based. I suppose in architecture, there's project-based learning, and in architecture generally, there are those elements that we look at. But apart from that, there's still a lot more that can be done, I suppose, in terms of that pace. It's really difficult working within the structures of universities to try and push those boundaries to do that.
Yeah, you're telling me. Can I just add to just thank you for that? It's I mean, I found it really a really important presentation of Cat at this time, but also following on from a lecture by Cochrane Studios last week, who are also quite involved with an understanding of making, doing, community involvement, the whole kind of ecology. And I mean that as a situated ecology. I don't mean environmental only ecology, but as you know, I mean, you were referencing it as well as a kind of overarching complex ecology around lots and lots of things, which includes construction, but also includes many other things. And referencing Montessori, and you might have referenced Steiner, you might have referenced a few other pedagogical models, which kind of understand the play and the wondrous sort of weaving of doing and thinking, really, and community and individual and all of those things.
Oh no.
Oh,
I think we lost you just at the end there. Oh,
All
you're
right,
on mute now.
Sorry, apologies. All I wanted to say was thank you for that. I think it's a really good, for me as head of school. It's a very, very important sort of continuous sort of wait a second critique. Hold on, just a moment. What can we do within the structures that you speak about, which are so overpowering at university level in this country? And I just came off a meeting last week with a senior leadership team, all around the very unfortunate marketization of higher education that the government is standing not only behind, but forcing as an ideology, actually. And those references to being non-capitalist and we have a kind of evolving articulation of we hope, an ethos of care and matters of concern that are interesting to us because they're so important. All of those things are I mean, there's that phrase, don't let the bastards get you down. It's super difficult for me but nonetheless we try in this system, and Cat is a little bit outside the system, which is really amazing. I mean, you guys have the opportunity really a little bit outside the system to restructure things, but also to have the kind of wherewithal and conviction to say, ARB, prescribe us, please. And that, I mean, I know the Cat and I know people there and everything else. So it's a long-standing relationship that I have with people who are there and who've been there. But it is it's a reminder. So I just want to thank you for that. It's an important reminder that things can be different, and sometimes we feel like the moves that we can make within higher education, architectural education within the UK, sometimes it feels like, oh shit, oh God, I can't do much, can I? But you can. You just got to keep going. Which is why I really appreciate the Passes, Polyphony series and how they're bringing in such important issues with the people who have been invited to lecture. So thank you very much. It was less of a question than a kind of thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks Gwen so much for the lecture. I just want to echo what Oren was saying about how countercultural Cat is and how active you guys are. I think it's really amazing to see. I wanted to ask a question just to confirm. You mentioned the software that checks for low embodied carbon. Could you just re-say what they were again?
Yeah. So HBERT or Herbert, I think it's called, which is Hawkins Brown. So actually one of our graduates is working on that with them, and some pretty whizzy people on the Revit. So it's a Revit plugin. And then Field and Clegg Bradley Studios have got their own little plugin as well. And what's great to see these days is that people are making it far more open source, because that's the really key thing that we need to be doing, is making these things available, so that it's not every practice making its own thing. We can share the knowledge to make progress. And both of those tools use the ICE database, so the inventory of carbon and energy, which is a fairly heavy Excel spreadsheet, but you can kind of search up, cement and find out all your different cement mixes and what their carbon, embodied carbon is. And I think they also do embodied energy as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
I don't know. Sorry, I just want to ask the Ben, is this chat saved as well?
I think it can be.
Yeah, no, I know it can be. I would just recommend that it is, because I've just popped in some links to that, which might be, just to follow it up. I think it's really important that, Gwen is, telling us lots of really important stuff, and to be able to easily follow through with it. Well, there they are. So
yeah, we'll make sure those get put in the link, the description of the video.
Great.
Yeah, and thanks, Aaron, for putting those in. Just seeing, the link to Jeffrey's podcast as well. It's a great podcast series that tracking a whole range of interesting speakers on the kind of natural building and sustainability circuit as well.
How soon can you? Because summer, was it last summer? I'd signed up for a couple of just because I wanted to sharpen my building skills again, and I was going to come up, and there was a couple of nice house build and small structure build and everything else. Have those started again yet? Quite? I imagine not.
No, not quite. So in Wales, we still don't know what's happening. We're finding out tomorrow what's happening in Wales. We're hoping to be back as a course on site in May. So I imagine, and I've heard that activities are going to be prioritized for the graduate school. So I imagine it's going to be June, July, and kind of onwards for the short courses. But I mean, absolutely happy to keep in touch between yourselves and us as the MArch as well. And the kind of invitation is always there to have other schools of architecture come to CAT as well, and to share the learning. Alison, who's the new program leader, is heavily involved with SCOSA, so I'm sure that we can develop links that way as well.
Yeah, no, I sit with her on council, actually.
Great.
So that's,
sorry, do you also sorry. Do you also have a link regarding the graduate program? I'd be interested in reading up on that as well.
The graduate school.
Yes.
So if you go to cat.org.uk, I will, and then there's a link in there under course and training to the graduate school. I'll pop that in the chat to everyone. Any more questions from anyone? Where it's gotten very dark behind me, and I've only got the desk lamp on, kind of fading into just a floating head.
Can I just, I'm sorry, I know I'm taking up a lot of space, but I don't see anybody else wanting to say anything, even Rachel. But you're it's funny because it's not funny. We're working on online learning for my kids here, and it's that just that little moment of saying, okay, look outside now, please. Just that it's so important, and thank you for reminding us of that. It's we just get so locked into this Zoom thing, and I realize that we're not even building in 10-minute breaks after every session. It is really difficult and can be debilitating for some. And just that looking out the window, I mean, I did it, as you say, I was looking out into the dark. I happened to be in Germany little bit later. So it was dark, and at the same time, exactly right moved in that moment to take my eyes off the screen and take a look outside, you know. And so thank you for reminding us that it's these really small moves which are so possible, but we sometimes forget. So Gwyn, thanks a lot. Appreciate that.
That's all right. Yeah, I mean, we're, you know, because of the way that we run as intensive modules, it's a real struggle for us to shift that to digital. So we've had to kind of adapt those ways as well. And we're still, you know, we're still learning and muddling through. I'm very much looking forward to being back.
Yeah.
I think Harry asked about the webinars you mentioned. In the chat, he just asked where he could find the webinars.
Sure. Shall I just pop a link? It's under the courses and training on our website. And I actually gave one last night about building with nature in mind, but there's a whole host of other ones as well from both the graduate school tutors and then also other experts that Kat's been getting in as well to talk on subject areas.
Great, thank you. I think Rebecca also had a question.
Jubilee?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mostly because I've probably spelt it wrong. I'm sorry about that. I was just wondering, because one of the things that I feel through education generally, I'm one of the lecturers here, but I have a history form, you may say, with building schools. And one of the things that teachers always say is that we wish we could teach between years. We wish we could kind of stop siloing experience. And I just wondered, is that something that you've managed to break up at CAT? Is that something that you do between years?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so we all teach pretty much everything CAT, or will at least be engaged in everything. We have people that kind of lead on things and then people that kind of support. And I suppose that's partly our size that we managed to do that. There's still much that we need to do. So the master's courses that I set out, we're still part of those, but we really struggle because they've had much more growth than we have. So we've managed to stay quite small, and they've got an intake of maybe 140 odd a year now. The site itself can't hold that number of people. So the architecture course is kind of less involved, which is a shame really in many ways, because we used to be, you know, you'd come and learn about architecture and then you'd walk into a lecture on global water security. And just that kind of complete diversity of knowledge that you'd get from doing that is something that we're really trying to kind of address and still keep involved. So yeah, I certainly feel you, it would still be great to, at CAT, even to be involved on those other courses more, to keep that learning. But within our
students work between the years as well? Sorry.
Yes, yeah, to an extent. So we've got certain points in the year where we're able to do that. And we do a lot of that because we're all together on site at the same time. We do a lot of one-day charrettes together. And we generally try and have live briefs for those. So there's usually, you know, one of those ran every couple of months, and maybe 3 or 4 points during the year. We're trying to start up a process of developing a manifesto led by the students that kind of evolves every year. That's a both years activity. But it's something that's actually much improved. But in the masters, when we were a professional diploma, there was only a 6-month overlap. And it was that kind of final crunch 6 months for the 5th years, and the 4th years were kind of all new. Whereas now there's much more kind of freedom for exploring that. So that's, I think, really enjoyed by the students, is that they can kind of learn from one another in that time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Were there any other questions anyone wanted to ask?
Hi, just to add my thanks, Gwyn. It was a really wonderful talk, and it's one of a series of 3 recently that we've had that really suggest alternative ways of practicing and thinking about ourselves as practitioners. I'm not an architect, I'm an interior designer by education. You know, it's my degree, and I teach on the interior architecture program. And I've just been thinking, as I've been listening to these 3 talks, I just really wonder whether our titles in some way hinder our imaginations, that we call ourselves something maybe limits the way we think about what we do. Because there's a history, isn't there, to the title architect and interior designer, and sometimes I just wish the titles would go away and we think about ourselves as designers and creative thinkers and practitioners in that way. Because yeah, anyway, that's what I just mainly want to say. Thank you. Then there's some really lovely quotes and references that you shared with us, so thanks for that. I love the what was it, the failure as compost of success.
That's a great one.
Great, yeah. So thank you very much.
That could only come from Kat, really, that sort of quote. Yeah, I think the title architect, when you're in practice, especially kind of small scale practice, you get it all the time in terms of, oh, you can just draw plans for this then. And it's like, there's so much more that I think we should be doing as, you know, as I said, as kind of facilitators, and we can be facilitators of change really successfully. That kind of isn't captured at all in that title. That, yeah, it's certainly something that the industry should keep exploring. Definitely.
I had just a question. I'm not really sure if it's going to make sense, but yeah, I was just wondering how you think like we as like part 1 architecture students, and I guess as we go throughout our architectural course, like how we should kind of push on these things and on these alternative ways of like making our practice better, I guess.
So I suppose, you know, I suppose if you're engaging in these sorts of things and the other thing, you know, things that are happening, so groups that are forming, discussions that are being had, then you're on the right path to at least thinking in those and kind of getting educated in those alternative ways, and also to be creative about not just in your design work, but also in all those other areas. You know, as the title is, it's kind of the ecology of all the areas that you might work or live. And you can think creatively about that you don't have to do 9 to 5. You don't have to practice in the same space as someone else. You don't have to work in that flow of 5 days, 2 days. And I think that's a really interesting thing that we have at CAT, is we have this kind of monthly flow, which isn't replicated anywhere else in our lives, apart from the fact that I disappear from my house for 1 week a month. But that sort of gives me a kind of rhythm as well. So being creative about all those constructs that people seem to impose on us, and where you might take practice. And it's really challenging. I've worked in practice where, you know, there was no wriggle room for thinking alternatively about any of those. You still had to do the kind of the long hours, the standard way of being an architectural assistant. So it's a challenge, and you've got to kind of, I suppose, work quite hard, learn as much as you can, and find people that are thinking in similar alternative ways.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think we're going to end there probably. But yeah, it's been so great to have you, Gwen. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, it's been great. Have a good rest of the evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good night.